This is the panel Cyberwar, Information and Disinformation in the Middle East. And I'm Guillermo Dolo Reyes. I'm an associate professor at the University of Houston and vice president of the Policy Studies Organization. Thank you for being here in Mid-East Dialogue. Our first presenter is Professor Nathaniel Greenberg, who is an associate professor of Arabic at George Mason University. And our second presenter is Dr. Sahar Khamis, who is associate professor of communications at the University of Maryland College Park. And we will begin with
maybe we're just having a intimate conversation today. It's okay. At least
back.
and the like. What's that? Ah. That's good. Okay. So just, I've had as I've been talking about this work for a couple of years, and at MIT, I was confronted by a group of passionate Assange WikiLeaks supporters, because this research does challenge the early narrative there, the early idea that WikiLeaks had been somehow pro-democratic in the support of the revolution. Whereas if you look at the content of the leaks and the way in which it was used, it was almost always supporting anti-democratic positions and reinforcing the relationship with RT in Russia. Assange, of course, had a close relationship with RT, which is the flagship newspaper of Russia. This kind of stuff continued throughout the first several years of the uprising and the post-uprising. See if this is going to work or not. This is difficult with a clicker. Oh well. The WikiLeaks continued to dump information concerning things like U.S. presence in Libya, which was spun as support for Islamists by far right-wing newspapers like Front Page in the United States, which was then literally translated and reprinted in mass form throughout Egypt with these kind of state-associated writers like Amr Ammar. The rise of the so-called Tamarrad movement, the sort of counter-revolutionary movement that brought the military back to power in 2014, was infused with this kind of narrative that the US was supporting the Muslim Brotherhood, that Obama was the founder of ISIS, which is what we get ultimately with Donald Trump. But that rhetoric, that sort of ecosystem, that media ecosystem, was very much turbocharged by the Russian associated and Russian-backed media ecosystem, with WikiLeaks playing a major part of it. So, yeah, apologies. I could probably just talk through the rest of it. What's that? There we go. Flash forward 2015, the so-called Russian pivot is now happening very aggressively in Egypt. This was an interesting, the head of Russia Сегодня, which is the flagship news organization out of Russia, signs an agreement with Ahram, Al-Ahram, Wab Ahram, which is the oldest state-run newspaper in the Arab world. Shortly thereafter, this is in a media lab that I work with, we found that articles that were reproduced on Ahram's website, but coming directly from Sputnik, which is the Russian state news organization, begin to proliferate at just an incredible rate. You remember that the Russians initially claimed that they had killed al-Baghdadi, by the way, which was information that they disseminated widely throughout the Arab media sphere. So this is continuing to this day. Lavrov has just been in Africa and accompanying the visit. I mean, there's a massive misinformation campaign occurring in Arabic now surrounding the Ukraine invasion. It's very prominent. It's very visible. And the way it works is, like we've seen for the last 10 years, an article will generate on Sputnik and will then flow through Gomorrah, another state-run, Egyptian state-run newspaper, will flow through the media ecosystem of state-run outlets in Egypt, like a Gomorrah, like a Yom Saba, and repeating the same information, the same story that's coming first through Sputnik. This is, again, I mean, I've spoke with some people who say, well, this just speaks to the success of Russian state media in Arabic, which indeed is true. I mean, it's a dominant factor throughout much of the Middle East right now. This is 2020. we can see where the majority of traffic is coming to RT. By 2023, and there's different metrics, SimilarWeb is not the best. We see now for RT Arabic in particular, Egypt very high, United States is still very high, which is interesting. Saudi Arabia. So this is again not surprising, but it's the numbers help fuel the centrality, the importance of Russian state media, which this is something I put together a couple of years ago, it needs to be updated. These are major news organizations as ranked by Alexa Analytics, which is one of the best tools for gauging internet traffic. Of the major news, and then the higher, the lower the number here, the smaller the number, the higher it is in the ranking. So in other words, like if you look at Iraq, RT is by far the most popular news website in Iraq. Egypt, with the exception of Yom Sabah, which repurposes a lot of RT material. But across the board in the Arab world, public discourse is driven by RT. I mean, Al Jazeera is increasingly irrelevant. Al Hurra is totally irrelevant in terms of, and again, now we're talking about not the high diplomatic conversations, but public discourse. The vast majority of literate news consumers in the Middle East are reading news now through their phone, like everybody else. And the dominant sites in most of the Arab world, like anywhere else in the world, are Facebook and YouTube are the two most visited websites by orders of magnitude. RT is a viral news site that disseminates information via Facebook and YouTube, which then drives traffic to their main sites. So yeah, Alexa Analytics, I think, has since become classified or something. I don't know. They've taken it down, but somebody bought it maybe down the road. I don't know. But you can see, it's interesting to see how it compares to Al Jazeera in terms of the network, that it commands, and also how its information moves into the Arabic media sphere. So really preeminently via Yom Sabah, which is the Egyptian viral state news channel. Again, just another graphic that I think is interesting here. This is, it's sort of RT, it's primarily derivative of users based in Russia, and then it flows into the Arabic media landscape through Sputnik News, which, as we saw with that agreement with Egypt, and then Yom Sabah, which is this, again, Egyptian state control, effectively sort of pseudo state controlled viral news media site. Sky News Arabia, which is interesting, of course, is the Emiratis, which we've seen tremendous coordination between Emiratis and Russia and across conflicts. The other interesting component of this, we'll see if it broke down here. Not long ago, Egypt really became a base for the exportation of Russian disinformation, targeting conflicts in Libya, Sudan, other parts of Africa, and the Libyan conflict, which of course is still raging. We saw this sort of mass social media campaigns that were composed primarily of bots and trolls, similar to the campaign that lifted the election of Donald J. Trump 2016, and similar to what we saw at the beginning of the Arab Spring, supporting the return of Saif Gaddafi and these kind of things. There was a particular operation that Facebook exposed that was traceable to organizations in UAE, Saudi, and Egypt. The one in Egypt was operating, the New York Times found, from a Egyptian military base, effectively. Yeah, and there's some information on all the sort of fake accounts that were associated with the operation in Libya. So again, today, Russia is pushing a very virulent narrative surrounding the invasion of Ukraine. We see on RT sites proper, we see user commentary appearing here that then is appearing on viral Egyptian YouTube specific sites. And this is the kind of narrative that's surrounding Ukraine right now. In the eyes of the crumbling Western imperialist world, slaps come at it from everywhere. They were betting on Russia's defeat. They woke up to the horrific fact that the Russian Federation had taught them harsh lessons. betting on Russia's defeat in Ukraine was a form of madness. You know, the same kind of coordinated, inauthentic behavior as Facebook describes it, you know, and just so it's interesting to see who are these users, whether, well, it looks like something like this. Okay, this is your perfect kind of troll creation here, no information, you know, some sort of pictures that can be copied and pasted from the website and then deployed, you know, across various media. And Sahar, I wanna step down and give you some time. You know, what's at stake, what matters here, again, is what is the narrative? So if we accept the premise that this is the dominant stream of information, potentially, for the majority of the literate population in the Middle East, what is the substance, the content of that narrative that is being pushed, that they're consuming? And it's really, it's not that surprising. It's straight down the line, anti-democracy, anti-Western, with a whole range of flowery language to support this. But the end result is what we're seeing very vividly today, which is a populism and a sort of populist support for increasingly for dictatorial regimes, including many that are in the direct political and economic orbit now, when we look at Africa in particular, of Russia. So, you know, this is, I think it's something that I'm looking at, and I don't know, maybe not too many people, I won't get into the gritty details here of some of this stuff, because I look at the way in which some of this viral material spreads. And, you know, it was in the co-optation of the BLM movement in 2020, the way in which it was spun. This was a piece, you know, something comes through Twitter of a shooting at a BLM protest in Utah. It's made viral on RT as proof of the violence of the BLM movement, and it circulates finally back onto Fox News. So RT helping make even domestic stories in the United States go viral, and really sort of preliminary to their appearance on mainstream US national news. The endpoint of my paper and what I'm looking at now is, so when we see how Russia worked at the beginning of 2011 uprising, as a kind of anti-democratic, pushing narratives suggesting of the US conspiracy and a coup, and then later pushing narratives suggesting that there was an Islamist takeover. Similarly, we saw in the amount of disinformation surrounding Black Lives Matter, 2016, again 2020, almost exclusively targeting BLM, trying to make BLM look like a very violent, very widespread movement, in the same way that we saw the demonization of the protest movement in Egypt and elsewhere in the Arab world, and Islamist actors in the Arab world as well. This was a interesting, disturbing documentary that went viral on RT, including RT Arabic, that was their interpretation of Black Lives Matter, again, as a violent, sort of chaotic movement that was also somehow kind of Islamist. So that's my talk. Thank you all very much. Okay.
Can we ask questions now or keep it for the end? What do you prefer?
Let's keep it for the end,
Keep it to the end, okay.
so that way we don't eat your time.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
and now the Professor Sahar Hamis will take the floor, and we will entertain questions at the end.
Having issues. Is there another clicker?
I found this one, I think it's because it's a very, there were many images coming out, so it took a time. I don't think it was the clicker, it was the size of the document.
Okay, so this shouldn't be a problem. Okay. And can you also show me how to use it and so on? Oh, that's the one. I can also remove this one. Full screen. Then move from here. Which one? I need to find this one. Can you open the fancy next?
Yes. No.
That's not my.
No.
Can I start? Ah.
Yeah, let's see it one. Yes.
Okay, now it's working? Okay.
Okay, now we're gonna start with Professor Hamis. Thank you.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Sahar Khamis. I'm an associate professor of communication at the University of Maryland, College Park. My area of expertise is Arab and Muslim media, with a special focus on cyber activism or the use of social media and new media in order to create socio-political change in the Arab world. I am Egyptian American. And my talk this afternoon is about cyber wars and disinformation in the Middle East. And it's always a pleasure to participate in the Middle East Dialogue Conference annually. Next. So the introduction, this paper actually tackles the exploitation of new media, especially digitally enabled modes of communication by Arab authoritarian regimes to crack down on opponents, activists, and also on journalists who dare to speak truth to power using a plethora of different techniques. These constraining practices will be explored during two especially significant moments in terms of the Arab media landscape and Arab journalism, the post-Arab Spring landscape, and also the post-COVID-19 pandemic, and we'll explain why each one of these moments was particularly important. In analyzing the first moment, special attention will be paid to how digital authoritarianism aided counter-revolutions in the Arab world through exploiting surveillance techniques and other mechanisms. And in analyzing the second moment, which is the COVID-19 pandemic, special attention will be paid to how cracking down on press freedom amid the mantle of fighting disinformation caused serious consequences and high risks to activists and journalists. Next, please. So let's take the first moment, which is the post-Arab Spring revolution. So the Arab Spring media landscape started with what we can be describing as a techno-euphoric moment, a moment of techno-euphoria. And I was one of the people who I have to admit was also part of this techno-euphoria, like writing about, wow, you know, social media and new media are these important vehicles and tools for enacting, you know, social and political change and transformation. The Arab Spring, of course, when it started, witnessed the rise of social media as organizational tools for demonstrators and networking among dissidents, and platforms like Facebook and Twitter were not state controlled. Therefore, it was possible for organizers to avoid government interference and censorship while using them as catalysts, amplifiers, and mobilization tools, communicating and planning protests, and also publicizing state crackdowns on protesters. So that's why these tools were seen as quote unquote liberating tools, right? Tools for democratization, for reform, for liberalization. You see here, this is one of my favorite images, right? This protester in the midst of the Arab Spring Revolution, he's like, you know, holding this banner. And if you look closely at the banner, you can see what he's trying to tell you, right? You see the word Egypt is written with different social media icons. So he wants to tell you social media has been very important. So the initial success of deploying cyber activism and citizen journalism in the Arab Spring uprisings gave birth to a unique moment of techno-euphoria or digital euphoria, where people were like attaching all of these high hopes and expectations to the power of social media and new media. So you see here just some examples from different newspapers and different, you know, media outlines and headlines and titles. Social media, the Twitter and Facebook actually really built a global revolution. Arab Spring activists relied on social media, and America taught them how to use it. So was Facebook responsible for the Arab Spring after all? the online ummah in the midst of the Arab Spring. If you see all of these different headlines here in the different media, what do you see? You see this kind of hailing, right, of the role of social media, and also hailing, quote unquote, like Western, right, democracy, especially the US, being the creator of these specific social media platforms. Like, let's give credit to Facebook and Twitter, and also give credit to those who created Facebook and Twitter in the first place. So much so that people would call it, oh, Egyptian revolution is the Facebook revolution, all right? And the Tunisian uprising is the Twitter uprising. And Syria's revolution is the YouTube revolution, right? And we're going to talk about that in a minute. Okay, thank you. So, from liberation to repression, authoritarian adaptation and reassertion. Now, despite the initial optimism and early success of the Arab Spring, of course, the historic pattern of Arab regime dominance and authoritarianism has reasserted itself in different forms and varying paces. So we really saw some kind of detour or backlash in terms of the Arab Spring movements, and the results or outcomes they actually yielded, which were far from what has been hoped for or expected. So in Egypt, a relapse to dictatorship, military dictatorship. Bahrain, suppression of an uprising. We call it the invisible or the forgotten uprising. Yemen, of course, war and humanitarian disaster. Libya, sectarian strife and statelessness and stateless state. And Syria, civil war and humanitarian crisis, one of the worst, if not the worst of the century. And the recent, of course, end of Tunisian exceptionalism. And I say that with a heavy heart, because I wrote a lot about like Tunisian exceptionalism. Tunisia is the only, survivor of the tumultuous waves of the Arab Spring, and it really was this exceptional model of success. Well, until recently, right? Until the president started to really kind of confiscate a lot of the authorities and powers in the country in a very sad way. So from liberation to repression, we see now the authoritarian adaptation and reassertion. This new phase led many human rights organizations and different groups that are protecting journalists and journalists' rights to sound the alarm. For example, according to Committee to Protect Journalists 2018 report, the new normal for Arab journalists now includes intimidation and arrests, imprisonments, being forcibly disappeared, losing their license or their job, and even losing their lives. This rising tide signals a shift from techno-euphoria to digital authoritarianism. In other words, social media shifting from tools of liberation to tools of repression. And this shift is clearly very much, highlighted in my own shift, in my own research agenda, from talking about the wonderful role of, cyber activism and social media as tools for liberation and change and so on, to now talking a lot and writing about digital authoritarianism in the Arab world. Also, this new phase led many of the regime's opponents and critics, including bloggers and citizen journalists, to either stop their activism altogether, both offline and online, avoid writing about political issues in particular, or flee their home countries and just simply exercise their cyber activism in the diaspora to ensure their own safety and the safety of their families and loved ones. This growing phenomena of Arab resistance in the diaspora, which is something else I've been also writing about recently, was, however, accompanied by a rise in the phenomena of transnational repression, which means going after those who are actually opponents of the regime, even if they are actually in the diaspora. And this characterizes what we call the counter-revolution phase, right? This is like, we had the revolution, now we have a counter-revolution. And this new phase was also characterized by government's exploitation of new tools and techniques, such as advanced digitally enabled surveillance mechanisms to silence dissent and even go after the opponents in the diaspora. So, okay, no worries. No worries, no worries. Yeah. Yeah, okay, yeah, thank you. So of course, one very clear and very popular, unfortunately infamous example is Jamal Khashoggi's case, and we all know what happened. So of course, he was this famous and prominent Washington Post columnist and contributor to many news networks. He was also an outspoken critic of the Saudi regime, murdered in Istanbul in 2018, and the CIA said with a high degree of confidence, with some kind of high royal family comments, and illustrates the dangers faced by critics of authoritarianism in the various Arab diasporas. But however, as much as this example is terrible and very famous, it is not the only example, because there are other cases, maybe not as famous, but they still actually happen and take place, such as, for example, Aruba Barakat, a Syrian writer and critic, and her daughter, who worked for Orient TV, which is one opposition television channel, who were killed in their apartment in Istanbul. And there are so many other cases, of course, that are too many to count for, but that means that there is this form of transnational repression, and that journalists are in many cases subjects of all types of wars and persecution. You have, for example, Omar Abdulaziz, who is a Saudi blogger, very famous Saudi blogger. He was a friend of the late journalist Jamal Khashoggi and dissident video blogger himself. He hosts a popular satire program on YouTube criticizing the kingdom and the royal family, especially MBS, Mohammed bin Salman. He is one of the top Saudi influencers on Twitter with hundreds of thousands of followers. And he resides in Montreal in Canada as a permanent resident of Canada. And he accused the Saudi government of hacking his mobile phone using the infamous Israeli spyware known as Pegasus, which was also used to track his friend Jamal Khashoggi and facilitate his tragic murder. So you're seeing here the element of cyber wars is really taking a new direction, right? It's becoming like not just regime to regime or country to country, but also between authoritarian regimes and their opponents, whether they are at home or whether they are in the diaspora transnationally. Muhammad Ali, known as the Egyptian whistleblower, is a former building contractor, businessman, and actor living in exile in Spain since 2018. He worked for 15 years with the Egyptian regime to build luxurious villas and presidential palaces. And he began circulating videos online in 2019, calling upon fellow Egyptians to protest. And he accused the Egyptian government of trolling him and sabotaging him online. So that's another voice in the diaspora where he's like basically saying, oh, there is so much corruption going on, and I want to speak up about it. And he was one of the main factors that led to some kind of limited protest that took place in September of 2019 in Egypt, and faced by a very strong and harsh consequence and quick response from the regimes. Regimes are also learning their lessons and building their learning curves and how to respond to crush any type of protest much faster than before. But that tells you that there is some kind of quote unquote impact or influence that these also transnational bloggers and activists and opponents have actually, even though it may not lead to a revolution as big and huge as what happened in 2011. So that was the moment we were talking about as the first moment, which is the post-Arab Spring phase. And obviously you saw this shift from the techno-euphoria to digital authoritarianism. And you saw the shift from liberation to repression, even transnational repression. The second moment I want to talk about is the triple pandemics of COVID-19. Can you go back to the triple pandemics of COVID-19, disinformation, and authoritarianism. So I like to always think of we have the COVID-19 pandemic, but it's not the only pandemic, right? Authoritarianism is also a pandemic. Disinformation is also a pandemic. That's why I like to talk about the triple pandemic of the three things together: COVID, disinformation, and authoritarianism. So the post-COVID-19 and digital authoritarianism era, the COVID-19 pandemic escalated the wave of authoritarian control over Arab journalists, as Arab regimes exerted every possible effort to control the narrative around the pandemic while suppressing alternative voices and alternative narratives, which might negatively impact their image both nationally and internationally. These parallel pandemics of COVID-19 and escalating authoritarianism triggered many dire consequences for Arab journalism and Arab journalists. And again, that's another line of research I'm currently very much involved in and actively writing about, because a lot of these governments started to use many different tools and techniques, under the mantle of we're protecting people from the pandemic or the spread of misinformation, when in fact they were using very high tech and very highly advanced surveillance tools to go after their own opponents. So the COVID-19 pandemic escalated this control, as we just said a moment ago. Can you go back again to the next, to the previous one? And this was clearly evident in the increasingly shrinking margin of press freedom. Okay. Yeah, this is good, thank you. So this was clearly evident in the increasingly shrinking margin of press freedom in many Arab countries in different forms and to varying degrees, such as controlling and seizing the ownership of more media organizations, closing down or downsizing other organizations, and blocking many websites. There's also the government's increased reliance on new technologies to track and jail the regime's opponents, including truth-seeking journalists, under the guise of protecting public health through using contact tracing and surveillance applications. And this is more widespread in some Gulf countries because of the economic affluence and technological savviness of the regimes compared to other Arab countries. So what you are seeing here really is a phenomena or a process whereby, right, compared to 2011, when the regimes were like, they didn't know what was going on and they panicked, right? They did not see this wave coming and like, oh my God, these young people are using all of these social media technologies and they're so advanced. And the regimes were like lagging behind, right? They didn't know what to do. And some of them started to simply do things like complete internet shutdown. And we know that was not effective. Actually, it backfired and had counterproductive results. And people went out to the street in more numbers. And of course, huge economic losses. Now they learned the lesson. They're starting to also sharpen their own tools, their own technologies and technological tools, and to jump on the cyber activism bandwagon in much more effective and nuanced ways. And then the COVID-19 came at another moment for them to sharpen these tools even more, like contact tracing apps and surveillance apps, in order to say, oh, we are doing this contact tracing app so that if you got in contact with someone who has COVID, we'll be able to know who did you actually contact and when did you contract the virus. Well, great. But at the same time, I can also contact trace you to know exactly also where you have been and who you have been communicating with. And that in and of itself becomes a very important part of intelligence information. So the dual weaponization of disinformation, right? If you think of disinformation as a weapon, the dual weaponization of disinformation. One of the most important media control mechanisms in the post-COVID-19 phase is exploiting legal and punitive measures, such as cybercrime laws, which criminalize any journalistic coverage that contradicts the official governmental narrative, under the disguise of fighting misinformation and disinformation about the pandemic. Many of these cybercrime laws are deliberately vague and broad on purpose. And this resulted in arresting or harassing some local journalists and even expelling some foreign correspondents in some cases in retaliation for challenging the official state narrative about the pandemic. Let me quickly explain this because it's a very important point. We often talk about, journalists being, basically killed or just, exiled or arrested. But yes, there's also something very important, the legal part. The legal part is very important. People don't talk about it enough, right? It's very important. So when you talk about cybercrime laws, many of these governments started to say, hey, we want to protect you. We want to protect you from the spread of misinformation and disinformation amid the COVID-19 pandemic. So we're going to create these quote unquote cybercrime laws, because if somebody is going to spread misinformation or disinformation, we're going to make sure that we're going to take care of this person, arrest him or her. Well, what happens in some cases is this particular journalist is going to write an article that does not fit the government's narrative about the number of infected cases or the number of deaths in the midst of the pandemic. And then before you know it, this person is going to get arrested, right? And it's going to be, his license is going to be taken away. In some cases, the website is going to be closed down or shut down. The newspaper can be shut down, and the person can face very harsh punitive measures like imprisonment, harassment, loss of his job, and much more. And that happened on several occasions. And interestingly enough, and sadly enough, it is not just local journalists, even some foreign correspondents. Maybe you know the case of Ruth Michelson. She was this, British correspondent who's actually writing about the pandemic in Egypt. And she did not even give her own numbers. She cited numbers from a Canadian center that the Egyptian government did not like. And as a result, she was called, she was, basically verbally told, what did you do? This is wrong. And then her license was gone to work in Egypt and she was expelled, told to leave the country. So there's even harassment in terms of foreign, not just local journalists and correspondents as well. However, this information, which commonly refers to false or misleading information, which serves someone's political or economic interests at the expense of the truth, has also been weaponized by Arab authoritarian regimes in another way. So some of these regimes use their tightly controlled state media to spread inaccurate or falsified information about the infection rates and death rates caused by the pandemic in their own countries to serve their political interests and agendas, while punishing those who dare to expose these falsehoods or challenge these narratives. So that's why I'm saying it's the dual weaponization of this information. So if I'm the regime and I have the authority and the power and the control over the political system, as well as the media system, I'm going to spread my side of the story, and I'm going to tell you that we have very few cases of COVID-19 and very few death cases and so on. Now, if you dare to challenge my numbers and to tell me something different, which I don't like, well, guess what? I'm going to make sure that I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to persecute you, and I'm going to actually have you punished under these very broad and very vague cybercrime laws in retaliation for you speaking truth to power and revealing the real numbers. So let's give some concluding remarks. Looking ahead, it is safe to predict that this tug of war or these push and pull mechanisms between Arab regimes and their opponents, including activists and journalists who dare to speak truth to power, will continue both online and offline, at home and in the diaspora, during the COVID-19 pandemic and beyond, triggering ongoing cycles of contestation between digital authoritarianism and cyber activism. So you're seeing really a tug of war, a push and pull mechanism, right? There are these, activists and journalists trying to speak truth to power and reveal the truth and so on. And then you have the regimes cracking down on them in a very harsh way. And that is not going to go away anytime soon. As part of these ongoing struggles, which are reflective of journalistic challenges to political autocracy, new tools will be invented by both parties as they constantly build their own learning curves and master new skills and new techniques to challenge one another in these digitally enabled political contestations. So just to remind you, 2011 was like the activists were way ahead of the regimes, much more technologically savvy, young, vibrant, active, they know how to use technology. Fast forward 12 years later in 2023, we are seeing these regimes and governments sharpening their own tools, jumping on the cyber activism bandwagon and going after their own opponents, whether they're activists, journalists, you name it, at home as well as in the diaspora, offline as well as online. And I don't think that this kind of contestation or tug of war is going to go away anytime soon, which really gives room for scholars like myself to write more about many of these issues moving forward. And with that, thank you so much, and I'm happy to take your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much to both speakers. Now we will have questions from the audience, both virtually and here. Do we have questions there? If there, I can open with a question for both panelists. And you talked, both of you talked about somehow of domestic governments or regimes now being savvier in terms of technology use, like for example, cyber activism and counter activism. And Nathaniel talked about the fake news, so international governments or regimes interfering in local governments in the Middle East. So my question to both of you is, what is the future, or what is the future of cyber activism in terms of the people from the the different 20 years ago, post 9/11, in different countries in the Arab Spring, and the use, and you gave us examples of the backlash, because now the regimes know. What is the future of cyber activism? What is going to happen now that we have AI, we have all of these people believing fake news, and WhatsApp now outside the United States is a way in which there is like a meme produced somewhere in ground floor in Mexico City, and now is going is in Russia or in South Africa. What is the future? What is your opinion about it, since you are experts?
Okay. Yeah, thank you so much. That's $1 million question, as they say, right? Because actually what we're talking about here is a new phase, right? And this phase means that you have, what I ended with, this kind of tug of war. So we have to really talk about the dual-edged sword or double-edged sword effect of social media, right? It can be a great tool for you to be able to create some kind of momentum and some kind of protest. But hey, now that the regimes are much more technologically savvy, they can also create all of these electronic armies, like for example, Syrian electronic army created by the Assad regime to go after the opponents and to be able to hack and troll and sabotage and so on. So you can start your own protest movement for sure, but also expect very much that you're going to be hacked and trolled and sabotaged, and sometimes your website can be shut down, or in some cases you yourself can be in danger, killed, or God forbid, arrested, and all of that stuff. So these threats are real, and you're seeing also in terms of misinformation and disinformation, like you rightly said. Yes, you can use it to spread correct information, awareness. Let's spread information and awareness about this particular issue. But at the same time, there is also much more room now to spread misinformation and disinformation. And I keep getting all of these messages, believe me, from overseas, from some friends and relatives abroad about, oh my God, did you take the COVID-19 vaccine? That's too bad. You're going to get a heart attack. You might just lose your life if you did not, already die, but maybe you have 6 more months to live or just 1 year. I'm like, great, that means I don't have to grade more papers and, do more things, that's awesome. So, and they believe it, and they believe these kinds of, basically conspiracy theories or propaganda. This is like basically a phase we cannot say like, oh, this is going to stop. This is going to be the end of it. We're just seeing the beginnings, actually. And my expectation is that moving forward, we're going to see more of both sides. We're going to see more of the regimes trying to control, sabotage, close, and so on, some websites. But we're also going to see the audiences and people, activists, especially young people, finding ways to circumvent, to get around many of these barriers and many of these hurdles, and maybe invent even their own ways of trying to escape from these types of controls. Now, is this the whole picture? No. There are also some cyber activists, obviously, who said, is it worth it? Is it worth it for me to be public facing and be very well known as a visible public figure who is an opponent online and then risk being killed or my family being killed? It's not worth it. So some activists decided to stop their activism altogether. Some of them decided to continue the activism under maybe anonymous accounts or pseudonyms, using fake names or pseudonyms. Some of them started to exercise their activism from the diaspora. But as we saw in this presentation, even when you exercise your own activism in the diaspora, there is still transnational repression, and you are not completely safe. There's always a chance that somebody can come after you. And we gave examples of Khashoggi and other cases. So it's really very, very much a risky business now to be vocal and to be visible and to speak out. But however, there are still some brave people who are continuing to do so. And I think they will continue to do so against all odds. Thank you.
I think you sort of said it all. I mean, I no, what I would say, I mean, the big picture for me that's sort of interesting is I think part of the counter-revolutionary push that happened to manipulate and co-opt social media was to explode from the inside out, a very democratizing, a very powerful tool for democratization, as we saw in the Arab uprisings. Putin and other authoritarians were terrified of this and, created alternate Facebook universes and things, and alternate, the internet is this powerful tool for accelerating democratic change. But I think at the same time, so I agree with you that I think as long as the tool continues to exist as a medium for communication, young people will find ways around the blocking, ways around the censorship. But what's interesting to me is that seldom do we find a kind of guiding ideological principle within that social movement. And I think this is the space that the authoritarians were able to infiltrate very effectively, was to come with very clear narratives that were ideologically designed, that tell a story that can cut through the cacophony of social media and the like. So it's a kind of a strange interim period, I think, that we're in, where a sort of populism is developing, but it doesn't have an ideology behind it. And it seems that the kind of, as I talked about in my talk, the sort of conspiratorial thinking, the anti-democratic thinking that has become so dominant now in the Middle East via these alternate and viral news channels that are repurposing Russian state media in different ways. That, unfortunately, I think is accelerating. And of course we see it in this country and other parts of the Western Hemisphere, as well as in Africa and Asia, all over the world. So the alternatives is, I think that the Western countries and democratic countries need to get their act in order in terms of I think revitalizing public diplomacy to meet the 21st century is one way to think about it. You know, I think broad-based investment in media literacy, sort of increased civic education to understand and deal with the new tools of communication. I think it's a slow fight, but you know, clearly, what's interesting is China's ascendance in this space is obviously very rapid and interesting. What they're doing with in Arabic, CGTN Arabic is, I mean, that is on the rise. They build their own, like similar to Russia, and yeah, a lot of this comes down to storytelling and who has the language, who has the ideas, the ideology. They build their storytellers from the ground up in a way that the United States simply does not. We do not have language expertise. We do not have this kind of intelligence, I think, that can meet not just the technical challenges, but the kind of ideological and aesthetic, the sort of gray space of this new cyber war. So it's an interesting time. I think, you know, but it's unclear. I fear that it will get worse before it gets better. Yeah.
If I can just comment very quickly on a couple of things that my colleague here said, the point about media literacy is extremely important, right? I think that everybody now needs to be media literate. Maybe we should still have, you know, some kind of education, even include this in the educational curriculum, not just at the university level or the postgraduate level, even starting from schools. You know, you see kids now as young as 2 and 3 year old, and they're holding their own handheld devices. You talk to them, they're not looking at you. Right? It's a very serious phenomenon. So if you want to really look at the future, what the future is going to look like, we will need to have media literacy education included in the curriculum, K to 12, and also in higher education. This is very important. Now, the rising powers of other, you know, players like, you know, China and Russia. I'm going to ask you about that in the Q&A later on. You know, these new powers are also very much now entering the field, having their own voice, having their own tools, right? In a way which we have to think about what are the implications for these new powers, you know, entering the field. And in terms of Western, you know, democracies, that's like a big disappointment, honestly, because some people will say, you know, hey, you know, we don't want you to necessarily support the protesters, but at least don't support authoritarian, autocratic regimes. When the 2011 revolution happened, some of the young activists at the time had an interview with one of the Western media. It was one of the American television channels. I think it was CNN, but I'm not sure. And they were asked, like, what do you want from the American government? They said, we just want we want one thing only. We don't want weapons. We don't want arms. We don't want money. We want one thing only, one demand only. Please don't support autocratic, authoritarian regimes, period. That's all we want. And in that regard, we can say that, unfortunately, there is still this ongoing Western support for autocratic, authoritarian regimes, which is a big disappointment for revolutions and a big, of course, asset for counter-revolution.
Any questions? We have a couple of minutes for any questions. Is there any online?
I asked this question at another group about an hour ago. Okay. My name is Don Travis. I'm managing editor at Armed Forces and Society. So wanted to ask you, you know that Vladimir Putin in Russia, they're promoting messages of traditional values. The message is that Russia and their side support those traditional cultural values, many of which are rooted in Western Christianity, the more traditional Western Christian views and values, such as, and I'll give you just one example, and you can pretty much figure out what the others are. Marriage is between a man and a woman, you know, and so on and so on and so on. And they're really promoting that. And the goal of such messages is, of course, to influence the American electorate, because we know the importance of the role of the United States in providing weapons and material for Ukraine. So I was wondering if you could address that message and that so-called information train that's coming out of Russia.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with your assessment. I think that's a huge part of it. Putin has framed himself as the great white savior of the Christian world. There's no doubt about that. And there's a lot of, the relationship with the Alawi regime in Syria, with the Assads, has ethnic tinges to it, racial ethnic elements to it. But the authoritarianism in general, I think I agree with you that but in the Arab world, it's tended to be virulently anti-Islamist. And like I showed in my talk, there is this association that developed in their viral media sphere and that became consumed on mass levels in public discourse. If we look at the internet traffic, this idea of a sort of Islamist takeover via democracy, this idea that Obama is supporting, and then it reaches the sort of heights with, Trump, labeling Obama as founder of ISIS and Hillary Clinton. So in a way there is, and that actually, I think it seems counterintuitive for people who understand the Muslim world and understand the conservative cultural values of the Muslim world, that there would be some parallels there. And I think those do exist. But I think what ironically, there's an acceptance of this kind of crusaderism, this kind of clash of civilizations narrative. But that's happening in the form more often of a sort of black propaganda. I mean, people are not, the lines are very blurred between, the media that's coming out from Russia and being, transmigrating across different outlets in the Arab world. So, this is a really interesting and good question, one that I do battle with. I mean, how it seems ironic. How is it that you have this kind of crusader-esque ideology that's persevering in the Kremlin and through its messaging and that is yet at the same time being consumed on a mass scale within the Arab world, which is also the target of that kind of messaging. This is a complicated problem. I mean, I think part of it is that you have two sides of the same coin in a way, in an interesting way, but also a great part of it is the phenomenon of disinformation, which is effectively black propaganda. So you don't know the degree to which you don't know the channels through which it's flowing. I think it would be useful to have that information made more accessible to consumers of RT in the Arab world. That it's not only is it anti-Islamist, but it's very much a kind of crusader, a white Christian vision of ascension on the global stage. And I think that often gets lost in the narrative.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This concludes our panel. Thank you to the speakers and the presenters and the virtual joiners. Thank you.